Well, good morning. Here we are with the steam car that I built some 40 years ago. It was built for a series of animation clips in 16mm. I was shooting with a Pallard Bolex at that time. And as you can see, the model is nearly 40 years old, but the last week I've been spent refurbishing all the parts. I've ended up having to get all the tarnish off the brass sections and actually to repaint some of the parts like the wheels. I've then taken clear lacquer and I put clear lacquer on. Some of the mechanical parts had to be, like the valve gear and the pistons and rod, had to be rebuilt. The headlamps were actually turned out of brass. The rims were actually manufactured out of brass. This was a bit of square tubing, and eventually I actually took perspex. I cut perspex to actually manufacture the lens, and how I did that was I cut a piece of perspex to fit the lamp size. On the reverse side I then fluted it with a file, and eventually I polished it on a buffing machine. You can see the steering on the front of the car is fully functional, and as they had in the old days with the steam cars, in order to get into your seat you actually had to lift the steering lever up, so even that's been made functional. Here we also have a little handbrake which works the rear wheel. And you can see there is a suspension. These screws can be adjusted to lower or make the suspension higher when you're doing the stop frame animation. Showing some more detail of the actual piston. This is your actual valve gear which opens and closes the port on the cylinder for open close position. So you can see the animation model has been built totally functional. This lever, which I actually have to complete at the moment, you'll see there you'll have your back wheel working, and this is to show you that this rod, which is your eccentric rod which works off the rear axle, will open and close the valve when it's finished. This is a little dummy lubricator which also has to be connected up once I've completed these new parts for the valve gear. Of course, the steam pipes that go in here and the exhaust pipes have not as yet been fitted. Okay, I've just about now completed the restoration of the steam car. There's a few little extra things that I would like to try and get done. I have to finish off a nozzle for the hose. Alright, we can now just use a little bit of cestic glue and proceed to actually glue the nozzle onto the hose. It should be more than adequate to hold it there. And then once again we'll do the same just with the other end. And there we have it. So that at least now makes the little hose look a little bit more professional. Right, that more or less concludes now in its total concept the car, the steam car. As I showed further on, I made a little shovel which will actually just be placed here for a little bit more detail. All the pipes and that have now been finally placed in position. Steam whistle is there, wheels are working. I can now demonstrate to the animators how the rear valve section works, and it's very difficult to sometimes go back almost 40 years and try and rebuild something that you'd made then. Much of the items that you made, it's difficult to imagine at the time actually how you produced them, and these rims, for example, had to be machined out of a long piece of steel pipe, so there was quite a bit of work involved with it. Once I had the rim, I used the compass then to decide how to make a jig, which I machined out of a piece of wood so that the rim could fit into the recess in the wood. The center part had to be accurately drawn to make sure that the wheel was going to be symmetric. Once I'd finished the soldering and making of the spokes, I then machined up a hub out of brass. The hub then had a center shaft to fix it into the wooden jig, and I then proceeded step by step to actually cut brass spokes the correct length and solder them. Especially with a wheel like this, I did the one side first, and once I'd soldered all those spokes, I then turned the wheel over and the rear part of the spokes were actually done. So in effect there was actually quite a lot of machining. Fortunately I had secured by that time the Myford lathe, and I was quite capable of machining up all the parts. I'd learned some of this in my instrument trade. So all the little fittings, pressure gauges, the cylinders, little valve boxes, all the pieces that needed to be machined, including the headlamps and that, were actually done on the Myford lathe. So it was many hours of hard work before I'd finally concluded. So here we have the steam car. It's now ready for the exhibition, which I now believe is going to take place on the 11th. So we just hope it's going to go well. We hope that people will enjoy seeing the actual model that was used in the short animation film that I made at that time. We can go on to discuss a little bit more about the puppets that were actually used in the 16mm, and as you'll see I have chosen out of the characters 3 characters here which at the time were fairly ambitious. These 2 characters, Flip the Frog and the Tortoise, were actually for the steam car, for the actual idea that I had of producing the Frog Steam Band, which actually involves a steam car with a calliope, which is a steam organ. The puppets were bigger than those that I had used in the 8mm, because I decided that to work with 16mm I needed slightly bigger sets, and I needed the characters to be a little bit bigger, and they obviously I could actually articulate and I could design and build in joints that were more suitable for these type of characters. Just basically most of the components for the characters were actually carved out of balsa wood. I sat down obviously with pencil and paper and designed the ideas, conceptualized the ideas in black and white on paper, and then transferred the idea into a 3-dimensional form with balsa wood, carving the main parts and components of the characters out of balsa wood themselves. The eyes actually were produced in hard wood and were painted. And small detail like the costumes and that, in many instances I actually found felt worked very well, because felt is a little bit more rigid than material, and when you are holding the puppet in order to articulate and to make the different movements, you'll find that the felt stays in place a lot easier. You don't notice movement. In the case of the frog, I made the hands and the arms and legs are wooden frames with a brass joint inside. It's a ball and socket joint that's got a screw that you can adjust to increase the tension to hold the character up, and then afterwards it was covered with felt. And in the hand I have actually a wire frame inside the hand, so you can actually bend the hand if you want to hold the banjo or you want different movements itself. You'll see in the case of the frog here I've actually also have a wire insert with a felt lower section on the mouth, because he actually does a little bit of animation dialogue with his mouth and says, "Hello, how are you?" So there's a little frog character who actually is the main driver for the steam car, and in that 16mm film insert you will actually see him driving the car, working the handbrake, getting out of the steam car, taking his hat off and saying hello to you. The little frog character never appeared. I never got that far of using the character in the 16mm because, as I said previously, I'd by that time become involved in television, and that was consuming all the energies that I had, so these puppets were stored away. But it's only recently that because of this festival that I've pulled the characters out and done a little bit of restoration and added a little bit more detail to them to finish them off. The tortoise, once again too, the cello was actually made out of balsa wood. And what I do is I stain the balsa wood, sand it and give it several coats of stain, and then use a clear lacquer in order to get that sort of cello look about it, you know, the hardwood feel about the thing. Small items were made in metal, and the little tuning pegs are actually turned out of hardwood. The face was made out of balsa wood. You'll see he's got a pair of spectacles on, and what I actually did was it was bent out of a brass wire, and the little lenses were made out of perspex and polished on a felt buff. Also, once again, the character in this instance has copper wire inside the frame. I didn't feel it was necessary to make a full armature, but however, his legs have got ball and socket joints. So those were the two characters that were for the steam car. You never know, I might get around to once again producing the complete film. This little character was used in a chalk bar advert and is a little hunter, and you'll see what I did here. I adopted a different approach where the character, all the components like the head, the body, the feet and the hands and that were all carved out of balsa wood. And what I did was I decided to use a gelaton, which is actually a lovely wood to work with. You can actually carve in gelaton. That a lot of people use them for carving murals and making different components because it's got a very fine grain. And I then produced slide joints or ball and socket joints out of using the gelaton, because the gelaton fits very well and it's got a friction feel about it. In the case of the ball and socket joints in the head and the neck and the hands and that, what I did was, once I had actually carved the ball and made the socket hole in the wood, I actually dipped them in wax, in hot wax, to give it a coating of wax, so that when I pushed it in, it gave me the degree of friction that I want. And I found it actually worked very well. The reason why it works well too is because the puppet made out of balsa is fairly light, so you can actually pin the one foot to the ground while you are actually animating the other foot. And because of the lightweight of the character, the ball joints in wood and wax actually work very well. They actually are able to hold the character up. So there you have the hunter, and he had a little costume made up, and he's once again his feet and shoes were done out of felt. And you'll see also here, in this case I used a little bit of metal and a bit of wood to actually produce his gun for him. And quite a nice little character. It's got a lot of personality about him, and once again too, I've actually decided to spruce these characters up for the show and put them on little bases so that they are more secure to be able to transport and to show to the public. Thank you.